Okay, let's have a look at the parts of speech in chapter 16 of 1984. I'm going to try and help you understand how I know which part of speech it is, because I know you may be thinking, how do you find out what part of speech it is? How do you identify the parts of speech? So I'll try and help you. Okay, so we got they, pronoun, standing in for Julia and Winston. Any word, any noun which stands in for another noun is called a pronoun. So this is another pronoun, it. Yeah, it's standing in for something. Now, I've read the book, so I know what it's standing in for. It's standing in for arrived at O'Brien's. They have arrived at O'Brien's. So the it is they had done it, they had finally gone to O'Brien's. That's what the it stands in for, the arrival at O'Brien's. They had done it. They had done it at last. So they is a pronoun and it is a pronoun. And do remember that subjects like they, which is the subject, the doer of the verb had done, and objects like it, it's an object, it's the object, it's the thing which was done. Subjects and objects must be things, they must be nouns, and so there must be a noun somewhere in the subject and object position. And so we've got pronoun, auxiliary verb making past perfect, main verb, and then pronoun, comma, and by the way, comma splice, they, pronoun, standing in for Julia and Winston, auxiliary verb, main verb, pronoun. And then there's a few different ways you could do something like at last. Personally, I would take it as a compound adverb. Yeah, I know that's a preposition, and so last must be a noun if that's a preposition. But it's perhaps easier to just see it as a two-word adverb. Yeah, because at last is telling us, it's the same as finally, isn't it? They had done it finally. They had finally done it. They had done it at last. Okay, so see that as a compound adverb, but you can break it up into preposition and noun, but I don't think it's very helpful. Sometimes it is useful to just see two words. You know, another good example is as though. As though is a subordinating conjunction. It's just a compound subordinating conjunction. So some words are best treated as compounds, and some you can take individually. Okay, and knowing that is very useful for parts of speech. Okay, but at last, like finally, eventually, or whatever, it's an adverb telling us when they had done it finally. Okay, now this is a determiner, a and the, and all other quantifiers are determiners. So we've got determiner, noun, yeah, determiners always identify a noun, and room is definitely a thing. The room they were standing in, yeah. Now, some of you might wonder what kind of construction that is, because the whole lot of that is the subject of the main verb, was. And you might be thinking, well, why isn't this the main verb, Dave? Well, it's not. Yeah, because the room was long-shaped and softly lit, and they were standing in is actually describing the room. Now, this is a lot easier to understand if you know that that the word that, the relative pronoun that, the room that they were standing in, has been omitted. But if you put it back in, it's really clear that they were standing in is a relative clause describing the room. So this is a relative clause, a defining relative clause. Even though we don't have the word that in there, it's still a relative clause. It's a defining relative clause telling us which room, the room that they were standing in. Yeah, and the reason why this is not the main verb, no way, is because you can take it out and still you've got a main clause. The room was long-shaped, softly lit. This is just an aside, you know, it's extra information, as they say. I mean, it's essential information, that's why there are no commas, but it's describing the room, and it's lower down the hierarchy because it's describing the room which was long-shaped and softly lit. Yeah, and so the room was long-shaped and softly lit. That's the top of the hierarchy. And then slightly lower, we described the room with that they were standing in. Yeah? And so, I mean, you could take that out. That's another way of understanding this. You can take they were standing in out, and you've still got a main clause. So it can't be the most important part of the sentence. It's actually just describing the subject, the room that they were standing in. Okay, so be aware that sometimes relative clauses will come in disguise, and it's because they're missing a relative pronoun at the front, like that. We can very often drop the that. Okay, let's keep going. The television... I'm sorry, yeah, that's main verb, adjective, and adjective, because it's describing the room. It was compound adjective, that's why you got a hyphen. And that is it's adverb adjective, but it's an adjectival phrase because softly lit describes the room. And so softly describes lit, it describes in what way it was lit, and softly lit describes the room. I hope the hierarchy is coming out here, because for me, the main, the top of the hierarchy is room, was, long shaped, softly lit. Yeah, that's the top of the hierarchy. Everything else is just adding additional